Next up, he's come straight from the pop-up lab to the stage, Professor Roland Harwood. He's been a real champion of innovation for a decade or more, although his look sort of belies that fact. Peter Pan. He has played a vital role in Nesta, which was once government funded, and it was the big UK innovation agency and development fund. But he's since left that and set up his own innovation agency called 100% Open. And he has, across the years, worked with everyone from, obviously, government, hundreds of startups, to huge brands, among them P&G. And he and Mike are great friends and colleagues from years back. P&G, Virgin, Oxfam, so all the big brands. Apart from that, he's a gifted pianist. Like all of our speakers, they have some other area of incredible achievement. He's a gifted pianist and has created the music for lots of TV and film programs that you'd know. You can talk to him about that afterwards. Right now, he's going to talk to us about how open innovation and actually inviting customers in has changed not only the way we market, the way we innovate, the way we structure our businesses, but actually also the very businesses that we're in. So thank you, Roland.
Thank you, Debbie. I'm embarrassed by that introduction. I'm also embarrassed because I'm labelled inaccurately as a professor, which I'm not. So just for the record, I quite like the sound of it, though, so I could get used to that. So I'm going to try that. I am a scientist, so I do have a PhD, which is perhaps where that came in physics, which is not normally something I say when I get up on stage to a room full of marketeers, but I don't know, I feel the need to confess that. And it's been my privilege to work with the 12 this morning on the volunteering brief, which, can I just get another round of applause for the 12? Thank you. So that was great fun. And normally my job is to try and bring sort of reluctant people out of their shells to be creative and work together. This morning I had the opposite problem. It was trying to get them to shut up and focus for a while. But no, I think they did a grand job, and thank you, and made my job very easy. So thank you to all of them. So yeah, the title of my talk is From Open Innovation to Open Business. Can I just get a show of hands? Who's familiar with the term open innovation, roughly knows what it means? Can I get a show of hands? Okay, about a third, I would say. Okay, so I will define what I mean, and then I'm going to explain, I think, where we go from here. Just one thing I was going to say. Oh yes, I am. The reason I told you I was a physicist was because I did a lot of hardcore maths, and I was saddened to hear that maths is one of the subjects that kids play truant from. I think maths is one of the best subjects out there, taught terribly by people who don't know the subject, but that's a whole other subject. So right, moving on. So yeah, my company now I co-founded with a colleague who does actually have a design advertising background. It's called 100% Open, and we, as Debbie said, work with all manner of large and small organizations, public and private sector, usually acting as a bit of a bridge and a broker and trying to make innovation happen in spite of organizational hierarchies and stuff. Anyway, I will come to explain what I mean by that. But I want to start with the Olympics, which is where we started this morning. We started with obviously the 2012 Olympics, but I think innovation has changed massively. And I think the way that we do innovation has changed massively. So I want to start with how it used to be. And one of my favorite examples of innovation when people ask me, it comes from the 1968 Olympic Games. Does anybody got a clue what that might be? Okay, fantastic. Okay, so that's exactly right. So obviously 68 was the year of the Black Power salute, which is the other thing that people remember from that Olympic Games, another iconic moment. But Dick Fosbury is this kind of mad genius who, contrary to everybody else, decided to not do the scissor kick, but run back first to the bar, but thereby blowing the world record, getting the Olympic gold, and a sort of lone genius in the way that we think about innovation. But I think the likes of Dick Fosbury, as kind of wonderful and as kind of anarchic as they are lone creatures. I think innovation is much more everyday, and I think it's much more a collaborative process, which is what I want to talk about. And so I think basically the world has just been wired up in the last 20 years in particular, and I think that's changed the way that value is created without wishing to sound too grand about it. And I think the skill set of innovation is less about the lone genius and the lone creative and the lone inventor. It's a bit more like the Power of 12 stuff. It's about great detectives who can spot the opportunity. It's about people that have access to the networks. And it requires a much more human approach to business and getting stuff done. It's about the people with empathy, which is not typically something that they teach in business schools. And so that's what I want to talk about. A nice quote from a guy called Jules Evans, who's a philosopher, I believe, says that new ideas don't exist in our heads. They exist in conversations between people. So I think the art of innovation is very much the art of conversation. So what I would like to do, just to start off this session, is to invite you, and I know this is always a bit cringeworthy, but I'd like you to talk to your neighbour, and preferably not somebody you know, so turn the other way. So it might be 3 if there's an even number. So my challenge is, in 3 minutes, I will encourage you to be quiet, and your task, if you choose to accept it, is just to explain to each other what you do, figure out something you could do together, make it practical, make it productive, see what you can come up with, and most importantly, because I'm deeply shallow, give it a name of some description. And you've got 3 minutes to do that. Your time starts now. Go. Okay, can I get your attention? I'm sorry to interrupt the conversation. Thank you. So I know that's always a bit kind of a weird thing to do. Can I just get a show of hands? Who managed to come up with something, whether it's brilliant or not so brilliant? Get a show of hands. Who actually came up with something in that time? Well, I didn't, but... Okay, so about half. How many of those people came up with something that's actually not pretty good? Pretty good. You think something, yeah? Okay. And how many... Okay. And how many of those people actually gave it a name? Okay. So I'd love to hear just 1 or 2 of our joint ventures. Can I just quickly get a microphone? Do you want to start us off?
It's called, what's it called again? Foodie Kids.
Foodie Kids.
Foodie Kids.
Foodie Kids. Okay.
I'm a food consultant, and this lady, Elizabeth, works with children. So we're going to get kids to help us make a new kids' food range.
Fantastic.
Get them to test it.
Round of applause, I think, for Foodie Kids. Thank you. Just one more, or anybody else feeling proud of their little joint venture? Go on, over there. Thank you very much.
I'm a creative director, and Becca is a fundraiser for the RNIB, Royal National Institute of Blindness, and one of the problems they have is getting people to understand that it's not complete blindness, it's often partial blindness. So when you're explaining the idea, how do you do that?
Yeah.
So our idea was that we would come up with some sort of box or some sort of solution that gives people partial blindness, and the name is Blind Spot.
Hey, round of applause for Blind Spot. Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for playing along. How many people just had a chat and totally ignored the instructions? Okay, thank you for your honesty. That's fine too. Okay, so it's not that hard, but it's what's hard, I think, these days is to have all these conversations and make sense of which are the ones to kind of follow up and which ones not to. So that's another topic. But I just want to kind of share with you, explain what open innovation is for those of you that aren't familiar, and then give 3 case studies of how I think world of business, especially from a large brand perspective, and today I want to talk about, is changing. So this term open innovation has some very technical definitions. It's been around since 2004, but we've simplified it as follows. So simply, open innovation is innovating with partners by sharing risk and sharing reward. So by partners, we mean simply anybody outside of your organization. It could be customers, it could be suppliers, it could be clients, it could be other brands. Anybody who doesn't sit within the hierarchy, anybody you can't boss around or use kind of internal political influence with. So it requires a different set of skills to kind of get stuff done. But it's not just transacting with external partners, and it's not just buying and selling of services, it's actually sharing risk and sharing reward. And generally people are quite comfortable with sharing risk because we're all in the job of kind of minimizing risk, but things get interesting when we get to sharing rewards, and that's what I want to come to. So super quick, there's 2 ways. Very good piece of work done by the London Business School and MIT a couple of years ago around different models of open innovation, which we've synthesized as follows, that we call Discover and Jam. So one is, there's 2 starting points for open innovation. One is a what question, and the other is a who question. So Discover starts with a what question. It's essentially a competitive marketplace where you know the problem that you're trying to solve. It's very specific. And you put it out through a sort of competitive mechanism, be it a crowdsourcing challenge or something like that. And it's very clear when somebody's met that hurdle or not. And it tends to lead to some kind of internal routes to market where you acquire intellectual property or you bring in ideas and knowledge and innovation. The other, kind of a little bit like we prototyped this morning with Power of 12, it is much more messy. It starts with a who, it starts with a group of kind of creative, collaborative people, and it's much more iterative, and it tends to lead to kind of joint ventures. So there's two different kind of ends of the spectrum, and happy to talk about that in more detail if anybody wants to talk about that. But the process, like any kind of good innovation process, starts with figuring out what the questions, exploring what the interesting questions are to answer, then shortlisting interesting partners and interesting prototypes, interesting propositions, and then taking them to market or creating value if it's social value that you're creating. So anyway, that's the theory. That's all I was going to say on that. But the problem with all of this is it's about it's a fundamentally more networked approach to doing business. And I think networks and networking still gets a bad name. A former chairman of mine used to say networking is only one letter away from not working, which strictly speaking, he is of course correct. But Chris Powell is actually an old ad man. Some of you may know him from, is it DDB? I can't remember which one, but which agency. But he was a consummate networker, knew full well the importance of networks. And I think part of the problem with networks is we generally can't see them. They're invisible to us. It's a bit like the volunteering challenge, but it doesn't mean that they're not important. So we've come up with a little framework around open business models that I just want to kind of present to you, and it's the framework upon which I want to present my case studies in this talk. So it starts in the middle. This maps on rather nicely with my career, actually, an unraveling of my career. So I started out as an R&D scientist blowing things up in a lab, talking to practically nobody, feeling rather alone. I'm sort of appealing for your sympathy, in a very closed and secretive kind of research laboratory, gradually moving towards more cooperative business models, to more collaborative and more co-creative. So I'm just going to build up this chart quickly so you can see it. And these are, it's a mixture of business models and techniques that are now reasonably well known, that become progressively more open the further out you get. And I would also say, in the middle, it's all about the organization as a machine. It's all about efficiency and it's all about process. Whereas on the outside, it's all about a much more organic, human kind of way of doing business. And so we're moving from kind of the machine. And I think Sheila touched upon some of these themes this morning, and I wholeheartedly agree, even though I didn't see the talk, but I think with the premise of what she talked about. So I'm not going to talk about closed, because I think we all get that. I think we know what that's like. That's all about minimizing transaction costs for the economist amongst us of doing stuff internally. But I think it's often not the case that it's cheaper, better, faster to do stuff in-house anymore. So, but how do we do stuff through partnership? It's often messy and complicated. So the first example I want to talk about is a more cooperative business model, and the reason, and from a rather traditional industry, namely the energy industry. So E.ON, one of the big six energy companies, often get hammered in the press, sort of pseudo-monopolistic kind of marketplace. Until very recently, companies like E.ON only had two products, electricity and gas. And innovation basically means investment in major infrastructure. It means billions of pounds, and that's heavily regulated. And so the scope for innovation, one might think, is very limited. But when we started talking with E.ON a couple of years ago now, they had, as many organizations do, a customer panel of 30,000 or so customers who would be sent a questionnaire once a month, and then some of them would complete the questionnaire in exchange for Amazon gift vouchers. Not massively original, but has a value in terms of gathering how people feel about certain stuff. But we couldn't help feel that it was a much more kind of creative way to engage those 30,000 people in a different way. So as is now increasingly common in perhaps other industries, we ran essentially a kind of crowdsourcing competition where we invited some of those, the most creative and entrepreneurial customers onto a platform. We ran a whole series of workshops, both online, which is the main picture here, but also some face-to-face ones. Our first workshop actually was terribly attended. It was in E.ON, against my better judgment, said, why don't you bring them to one of our power stations in just outside of Nottingham? And I thought, this is never going to work. But because they were a new client, I wanted to be nice. And I said, oh, sure, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. You obviously know better than I do where your customers are based. Anyway, 2 people turned up, and I was totally mortified at this kind of disaster. But these were 2 really... One guy came with 7 years' worth of printouts of his energy peaks and troughs of his energy consumption in his house. And a bit of an odd guy, but just, some people collect that data, in his case on paper. Another guy, really interestingly, worked for a small electronics company, was an E.ON customer, but worked for a small company that produced LED lighting that was super energy efficient. And E.ON ended up, after a considerable time, I must confess, doing some business with this guy that turned up for the first workshop. Anyway, needless to say, I don't wish to sound too London-centric about it, but we held the other workshops either online or in London, and we had more attendees. But actually, what was really fascinating for me was my background being R&D, which I appreciate most people in the room probably isn't that, but as an R&D sort of person, you don't really get to talk to customers very often. So we had, even though we only had 2 customers in the room, that was 2 more than they'd normally spoken to in their day jobs. And it was actually a really kind of fun and creative session. So anyway, we ended up having thousands and thousands of customers engaging through this process, and our task was to find new revenue streams that wouldn't otherwise have happened. Eventually, the third iteration of which linked to a Channel 4 TV program called Home of the Future. And there were a series of things that are now being rolled out. One is an electric vehicle car scheme for other big employers. Another, which is quite nice, is an energy a smart meter which exists, but it monitors energy patterns, and especially in kind of older and vulnerable people's homes, it can tell social services or your family, if you set it up, configure it to be such that if grandma doesn't turn the kettle on at 7:10 in the morning as she does every other morning, then there might be something wrong and it's worth picking up the phone. And so it's called Care Sense, and it's particularly targeted at kind of vulnerable older people. All kinds of issues around kind of security and privacy and Big Brother, etc., that we need to take into account. But anyway, and the thing that really brought this home to me was at the end of the process, we had some people from E.ON's customer services team saying, oh, we've just got to train some new recruits, and can you just give us a few examples of where people have been on your online community and they've been mouthing off about E.ON and how you handled those kind of negative queries. And we, we're trying to be helpful, and so we mined it. And that it was an overwhelmingly kind of positive experience. And that at one point in the middle of this process, E.ON did put its prices up quite significantly, which was, tricky, and a few people did kind of mouth off. But apart from that, there was really very little kind of negative kind of commentary at all. And I think the reason for that was because there was E.ON people identified as E.ON having a conversation with customers, and it wasn't always positive. Or, there was often frustration kind of underpinning it. But I think a lot of people felt wanted to influence, a big sort of massive, very hard to engage kind of company like E.ON, and just this, gives them an opportunity to be heard. And there were prizes and there are other incentives, but actually just opening up that communication channel is just so vital. Stuff like this happens in other industries, perhaps more than it does in energy, but I think there's a lot more scope for that. So this is my first example of a kind of more cooperative business model. The point I just want to reinforce is that often, senior executives say one of my top 5 strategies for this year is to become more innovative, or innovation is one of our strategic drivers, or what have you. But I think that often focuses us on the wrong thing. It treats innovation as a thing to be produced. It has this still kind of factory mindset. And I think that's aiming at the wrong thing. I think the thing that we should aim and strive to create are productive and engaged communities and networks. And if we do that successfully, then innovation is a byproduct that comes out of that. It's not an end in itself. And I think that definitely happened in the E.ON case. But E.ON was still quite conservative in many ways. The next example I want to talk about kind of links, I think, to some of the stuff that Mike's going to talk about from Procter & Gamble after me, which was a process we did with Orange. And to cut an extremely long story short, Orange have something called Orange Wednesdays, if you're familiar with it, 2-for-1 films on a Wednesday. The problem with Orange Wednesdays, it's massively successful, it's been running for 10 years or so, is that it only happens on a Wednesday and only happens in cinemas. So it's actually relatively restricted. But it's one of the key reasons why people join Orange and stay with Orange, which is, if you understand this market churn within mobile phone industry, about 25% of customers jump networks when their contract expires, and that's the most expensive customer segment to service. So anything that can keep people for an extra duration of their contract is a very valuable thing. Anyway, so the call to action was, we want the next Orange Wednesdays, and there was a lot more detail beneath that, but that was essentially it. I guess I profoundly believe that if you're able to articulate what it is you want, 99.9% of the time, the solution is already out there. There is a tiny fraction of the time when you have to invent something brand new, but most of the time, it's just a question of finding it already. And I think too many organizations, it's a cliche to say it, but reinvent the wheel over and over again. But I think 21st century innovation, social network powered innovation is all about finding those people, finding those organizations. And in this case, Apparently it was a tweet of mine that led to a guy who wasn't even at the launch event, chief executive of a small company called Last Second Tickets, saw the tweet, entered the process, and to cut a very long story short, Orange ended up acquiring the company, rebadged the service Fund Finder, and it launched late last year. And Orange are already on record as saying it's a £20 million service that came through this program. So a very valuable process. I guess one of the challenges between large and small companies is that small companies are worried that they're going to get ripped off by the large companies, quite rightly in many ways, but also they have no idea how to get into the big company. There's no easy front door generally to these large organizations. On the flip side, big companies struggle with dealing with the gazillions of small companies out there and all the mad, the bad, and the sad, of which there are many. But also, there's all kinds of issues around IP contamination. If they have a meeting with somebody who discloses something that is partially protected or unprotected, it exposes quite a considerable risk. And so there's basically a fundamental communication breakdown between large and small companies. And so what some companies like ours do is create what we call an innovation airlock. So we sign legal agreements upstream with our client, Orange or Procter & Gamble, and then we sign a separate set of agreements with a small number of smaller companies downstream and just shield intellectual property. It means the big company really has to trust us, and the small companies have to trust us that we're not going to steal their ideas. But I think this role of broker is something that we do quite well in the UK. We're very much a sort of intermediary in all kinds of different industries, and I see that as a kind of emerging kind of role, both for us as an organisation, but kind of more broadly here in the UK with being smack dab in the global time zones, English language, diversity of cultures, all the rest of it. So this is moving towards a more collaborative way of working. In Orange, we've now rolled this out in other territories across the world. And then my final example, I keep on forgetting, I put a quote after each of these. So a guy called Paul Van Aggs, who we've worked with from Oxfam, says innovation is a U-shaped process, by which he means, I think, it's fun at the beginning when you're meeting new people and you're having ideas, and it's fun at the end when you're launching products and you're making money, but it's generally bloody awful in the middle when especially you've got multiple organizations pulling in different directions, and this is often where things get killed with different organizations and different motivations. So it's important to A, have a process, but B, have momentum that kind of gets you through that U and gets you through to the other side. And then my final example, my favorite project without question that we've done in recent years is with Lego, who's been a great privilege of ours to work with them on their open innovation strategy and more recently implementing bits of that. And this is really getting into the more kind of co-creation kind of domain of the spiral that I talked about at the beginning. Some of you might be familiar with something called Lego Mindstorms, which about 10 years ago was a robotics product developed by about 10 people in-house, launched onto the market, and within a matter of days, there were tens of thousands of people talking about the product, which is great marketing, but more importantly, hacking into the code. There was code within the robot, within programmable chips within the robots. And they were making the robots do new and better and cool stuff, picking up your washing and sticking it in the washing basket or bringing you dinner in the lounge or whatever it was. So in short, these people were actually innovating Lego's product. And Lego thought about actually trying to shut this down because they were, according to the letter of the law, infringing on Lego's copyright. But partly because they knew something interesting was happening here, but also because it happened in the blink of an eye and they couldn't really respond fast enough. They ran with it, and it became, at the time, Lego's most successful product of all time. And they've gone on to do stuff like Lego Architecture, which you may have seen, which again was an external entrepreneur who tried repeatedly to sell his idea into Lego. Lego Architecture is iconic buildings, Tower Bridge and the Empire State Building built out of Lego. They charge 70 quid for about 100 bricks. The profit margin on it is enormous, but it's a beautiful product. It's a great product, and it's targeted at adults. Interestingly, the fastest growing kind of customer segment for Lego is adults. But what's interesting is this external entrepreneur had tried dozens of times to get into Lego and had kept on being told no, 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 no every time because he hadn't found the right person to talk to. And eventually he found the right person, and he's now a multi-millionaire. And Lego's doing very well, thank you very much, on the back of that relationship. But the main thing I want to talk about from Lego is this thing called Kuso, which they launched in Japan nearly 2 years ago now. And it's basically a design competition. So anybody can submit a design for a new Lego product. Then you have to, kind of like Kickstarter, for those of you that are familiar with that, you have to attract 10,000 fans of your product. And if you do that, Lego commits to actually shipping it and putting it in a box with instructions, and it then becomes a legitimate Lego product. There are various caveats, but that's basically the proposition. But most importantly, to the kind of shared risk and reward kind of concept, is they share 1% of the royalties of that product with not only the person who came up with the idea, but the other members of the community that helped make it even better. And so 1% doesn't sound like very much, but 1% of a big number is still a big number. And it forced Lego to publish for the first time its revenues per product, which it had never done previously. So it required some fairly clever, transparency and public accounting, which they hadn't done before. So it wasn't just a product innovation; it was a whole kind of business model innovation. And I think one thing that I've really learned from working with Lego, but all of these examples, is that for every 100 customers of Lego, some of them are, well, in the case of Lego, all of them are being creative, I think, using the product. But some of them have tangible business opportunities that they're trying to share with you. They have good ideas for your products, if only you would listen. And I think it's too easy to say no. And increasingly, if you do, then you'll get left behind. And so I think we have to figure out a way of listening. It's hard, but anyway, so that's... and I think the best way to do that is through... I was struck this morning from the CSV challenge. I was reminded of a quote from Arthur Ashe, who said something like, from what we get, we make a living, but from what we give, we make a life. And I think the same applies in business. If you're able to give to get, give kind of a platform, give resources for others to build and be creative on top of that, then you reap rewards from that. I think it's a leap of faith, but I think it's very much true. And I think 21st century business, I'm obviously a naive optimist, else I wouldn't be standing here talking about innovation, but I genuinely think we need a much more optimistic way of doing business, and only those that are transparent and open and straight, good, decent people to work with will kind of go on to thrive. And I think the days of ripping each other off are numbered, because you can't run away from your reputation anymore in a way that you once could, especially, even big companies. So generosity is a bit like compound interest. The sooner you get it in the bank, the greater the dividend. So I sort of urge you to try and find a way to be generous as quickly as you can and see what happens. So I'm nearly done, nearly out of time. So just to recap, there's a whole bunch of buzzwords and business models around this space. I don't think there's a right or a wrong on this spiral. I think if I just build this up, there's a whole bunch of companies doing very well at each step along the way here. And I think the bad news is, especially, I think small companies do all of these sorts of things all of the time because they have to, through necessity. Large companies need to be reminded that actually, hey, it pays to collaborate sometimes. But all I want to say was there are successful examples at every step along the way. And so I think we just need to become more agile, more T-shaped in the language of IDEO, if that means anything to you. So anyway, that's mostly it from me. Just a few more quotes, because I like quotes. Excuse me. So we did the little 3-minute joint venture. Thank you for playing along to that. There's a very interesting guy. Sorry, I need to drink something. Very interesting guy for kind of network complexity science geeks, if there are any. I am one. Talks about the way people connect is based on their similarities, social objects, but the real benefit comes from the differences that we have. So that's a little bit what the 3-minute joint venture was hopefully supposed to tease out. There are all these business models out there. We need to get a grip of them. The world, they say it's a small world, but actually the networks are just getting bigger and more intertwined and more interconnected. So that's the challenge that we face. And this isn't really a new thing. This is what's happened. And this is very un-British of me to kind of end with such a kind of grandiose quote. But, the history of civilization is essentially more and more people sharing more and more stuff. And I think short of an apocalypse, I don't want to end on too down a note, but short of an apocalypse, I don't see that connectivity going anywhere, and I think we therefore need to figure some of this stuff out. I think the business models need to be reinvented, and sort of openness, transparency is at the very heart of that. So anyway, thank you very much for your attention. Sorry, I've slightly overran, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you.